Good afternoon, South African Student Association in the Russian Federation. I express my sincere gratitude for having been invited to deliver this keynote address for the Freedom Day in South Africa 2026. I've taken enough time to actually page and read through the history of Africa to try and actually put together a compelling keynote address that would not only be a fitting tribute for this particular day, but also to evoke emotions and to challenge us to rise to the occasion of defining exactly our role in post-liberation South Africa in terms of what freedom means. But without wasting much time, let me give you the write-up that has been actually prepared for this event. I have titled this write-up to fit your journeys of discovery of education from Africa to the Russian Federation. The title of the keynote address is From Accra and Johannesburg to Moscow: The Geopolitics of Freedom and the Making of a Post-Colonial Society. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I greet you with profound respect across languages, cultures, and histories that reflect our shared humanity. In South African expression, it is Sanibonani, and in Russian it's called Kharasho. These greetings remind us that beyond geography and political systems, we are bound by a deeper human search for meaning, dignity, and possibility. At the very beginning of this reflection, I draw inspiration from the intellectual and moral imagination evoked by Steve Biko Memorial Lecture that was delivered in the University of Cape Town, particularly the powerful reflections of writer Ben Okri. In his meditation on Steve Biko's legacy, Okri reminds us that through the language of imagination and consciousness, that freedom is not political, but also deeply mental and spiritual. He challenges us to understand that societies are first transformed in the mind before they are transformed in reality. This idea is important for our gathering today. The journeys from Accra, Johannesburg, and other cities to Moscow were not only physical journeys, they were journeys of imagination, of young people daring to believe that education could become a weapon of liberation and that knowledge could reshape history. In the long unfolding of human history, freedom has never spoken in a single voice. It has arrived as dialogue, sometimes as thunder, sometimes as silence, sometimes as patience carved out of suffering, and sometimes as agency that refuses to delay. In the reflective spirit associated with Ben Okri, freedom is not a finished event. It is a living conversation between memory and possibility, between what humanity has endured and what it still refuses to become. Part 1 of my submission to you is titled The Unfinished Work of Freedom, Nkrumah, Lumumba, Mandela, and the Call of History. Today, that conversation takes a triangular form, spoken through Kwame Nkrumah and Patrice Lumumba and Nelson Mandela. These three architects of liberation whose ideas continue to shape how we understand freedom across Africa and the world. Around this triangle lies a wider historical field shaped by global currents of solidarity, particularly those articulated through the internationalist philosophy of the Soviet Union. This field does not replace the triangle. It intensifies it, situating African liberation within a broader struggle over knowledge, power, and human equality. But before freedom came philosophy, it was geography. Before it became speech, it was a movement, forced, interrupted, and resisted across the body of a continent. From the western edge, Ghana stands as both a wound and prophecy, the coast where the door of no return swallowed millions into the long night of slavery, and the same ground that would later break that silence by becoming the first sub-Saharan nation to reclaim its independence. In Ghana, history turns back on itself. Exit becomes return, and loss becomes the first language of freedom. To the south, South Africa rises as another threshold, not of departure, but of arrival. Here at the tip of the continent, ships did not take people away. They brought systems that would interrupt entire ways of being. Colonialism did not pass through, it settled, hardened, and rewrote the terms of life itself. It is here that dispossession became structure and inequality became law. South Africa is where history lingered, where domination sought permanence, and where resistance had to become equally enduring. At the center, vast and restless, lies the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country of many stories, carrying the weight of immense wealth and immeasurable suffering, marked indelibly by the brutality of King Leopold II of Belgium. The Congo reveals a form of cruelty that was not accidental but engineered, extraction turned into systems, violence disguised as administration. Yet it is also a place of deep memory and cultural resilience, where Africa's contradictions, abundance and plunder, silence and resistance continue to coexist. Together, these spaces form a more than a map. They form a living triangulation of experience. Ghana, where Africa was forced outward and began its return. South Africa, where colonialism entered and attempted to stay. And Congo, where the heart endured and remembers. This is the ground from which the philosophies of Nkrumah, Mandela, and Lumumba emerge, not as abstractions, but as responses to lived history and the birth of a desire for freedom. For Kwame Nkrumah, freedom was never symbolic, it was structural, intellectual, and continental. His warning that, and I quote, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa," closed quote. This emerged from precisely this fractured reality. He understood that political independence without control of resources, knowledge systems, and institutions would remain incomplete. His vision demanded more than flags and anthems. It required the reorganization of African economies, the creation of continental unity, and the decolonization of the mind itself. His idea of freedom is architectural, something to be built, sustained, and defended. If Nkrumah designed the structure of freedom, then Patrice Lumumba revealed the cost of building it. Emerging from the Congo at the violent crossroads of colonial extraction of the Cold War rivalry, Lumumba spoke from rupture rather than theory. His leadership unfolded in the midst of secessionist crisis, foreign intervention, and ultimately his assassination in 1961, an event that exposed the global stakes of African independence. Lumumba rejected gradualism because history gave him no time for it. For him, independence without economic control was illusion, education without liberation was manipulation, and sovereignty without dignity was merely domination in another form. He did not simply call for freedom. He forced the world to confront its delay, making agency itself a political language. Nelson Mandela transforms the meaning of freedom once it has been fought for. After 27 years of imprisonment, his release was not only a political transition, but a moral test at the moment where South Africa stood on the edge of possible civil conflict. The demand for retribution was real and historically grounded. Yet Mandela chose a path of negotiation and reconciliation, not out of weakness, but out of disciplined strength. His assertion that to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. This reflects on a vision of freedom rooted in responsibility. It required restraint, compromise, and the risk of alienating those who sought immediate justice. Mandela's contribution is to give freedom ethical depth, transforming liberation into coexistence. Surrounding this triangular vision is a broader global field, shaped in part by the internationalist philosophy of the Soviet Union, which held that no society could be fully free while others remain oppressed. This perspective helped generate educational and political networks that connected Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The institutions such as Patrice Lumumba People's Friendship University emerged as spaces where students from newly independent nations of Africa could access higher education and participate in shared intellectual projects. At the same time, this system existed within the strategic tension of the Cold War, where ideals of solidarity were often intertwined with geopolitical influence. Recognizing this complexity deepens rather than diminishes the meaning of global liberation. When these elements are held together, a more complete geometry of freedom emerges. Nkrumah gives freedom structure, Lumumba gives it agency, Mandela gives it ethical discipline, and the global field reminds us that freedom is never isolated, but shaped through international relationships and struggles over power and knowledge. Freedom in this sense becomes a layered human responsibility. It is economic, intellectual, moral, and global. In the philosophical imagination of Ben Okri, history is never silent. It continues to ask whether humanity has yet understood itself. And so, we are left not with certainty, but with a demand, not whether freedom has been declared, but whether it has been realized in institutions, in consciousness, and in the lived dignity of every human being. In our own time, the question returns with renewed agency. Where do we see Nkrumah's call for structural independence, Lumumba's refusal to wait, and Mandela's discipline of coexistence? For in the end, freedom is not a monument we inherit. It is a conversation we are still required to complete. Freedom is a fire that refuses to die. On this day, we are called to confront a question that refuses simple answers. What is freedom? Is it the right to vote, raising of a flag, or the echo of a national anthem? Or is it something deeper, something unfinished, something still being fought for in the everyday lives of ordinary people? We stand in societies marked by contradiction. We speak of freedom, yet many live under the crushing weight of poverty. We celebrate independence, yet corruption and political violence erode the very institutions meant to protect that independence. We claim liberty, yet inequality continues to define who lives with dignity and who merely survives. So, we must ask ourselves honestly, are we truly free? Freedom cannot mean having more than one's neighbor while they go without. It cannot mean the power to exploit, dominate, or accumulate at the expense of others. That is not freedom. It is injustice wearing the mask of liberty. Freedom, if it is to mean anything real, must be shared. It must be measured not by the height of a few, but by the dignity of us all. For those who came before us, freedom was never abstract. It was lived, suffered, and paid for in the highest human currency. It meant exile, imprisonment, sacrifice, and for many, death. It meant leaving home in search of knowledge, organizing in the face of violence, and daring to imagine a world that did not yet exist. But here is the truth we inherit. Freedom did not end when political power changed hands. It did not conclude with independence or democracy. It was never meant to. Freedom is a continuous project. It is the struggle to ensure that every child, whether in Kumasi, Accra, Soweto, or Matatiele, has access to clean water, quality education, and healthcare. It is the demand for land reform that restores dignity and economic participation. It is the insistence that institutions serve the people, not the powerful. It is the refusal to accept corruption as normal or inequality as inevitable. Freedom is not only about removing chains, it is about building conditions where all can thrive. It is the ability to live in dignity, to think, to learn, to question, to create, and to contribute. It is the right to belong to a society that recognizes your humanity fully. As students, you occupy a critical space in this ongoing struggle. You're not merely beneficiaries of past sacrifices. You are custodians of an unfinished vision. The question is not only what freedom means, but what we will do with it. Will we accept a version of freedom that leaves millions behind? Or will we push beyond comfort and complacency towards justice? Will we inherit systems as they are, or will we transform them into what they were meant to be? Freedom demands more than celebration. It demands participation, courage, and the commitment to something greater than individual success. A commitment to the collective good of humanity. So let this be your answer today. Carry it in your voices and written in your actions. Freedom is not an end point, not a moment, not a gift handed down untouched. It is a fire, restless, demanding, and unyielding. It burns in the questions we dare ask, in the injustice we refuse to ignore, in the futures we insist on building. And it is a fire. And if it is a fire, then it must be fed by courage, by conscience, by collective struggle, until it lights up every corner of our world. Part 2. The education of the liberated, a dream in motion. Fellow builders of the future, there are children who learn under broken roofs and children who learn under the open sky. Some read beneath steady electric lights, others read by memory, by instinct, by the quiet fire of wanting more than what the world has given them. And in that quiet fire, a continent waits. Education in Africa has never been neutral. It has always asked a question: who is it for? Who does it serve? And who remains outside its gates? In the rural villages of Ghana, in the scattered communities of the Congo, and in the rural settlements and townships of South Africa, learning is not often an act of endurance. There exists an invisible majority, brilliant, unrecognized, and waiting. A girl solves equations in her head, but has got no textbook. A boy understands machines, but has never touched a computer. Poverty does not diminish intelligence, it hides it. What is missing is not genius, but access to education. So, we must say clearly and without apology, education for the liberated must be an act of justice, not charity, not rhetoric, but justice. An egalitarian education does not ask whether the poor deserve to learn. It assumes that they must lead. It builds a world where the village school stands with the same dignity as the finest school in Sandton, where the child of a worker carries the same horizon as the child of the powerful. A nation that educates not only a few chooses to see with one eye. Our history teaches us this. In the years of struggle, young Africans crossed oceans in search of knowledge, not as escape, but as a preparation. In distant classrooms, they learned science, strategy, discipline, and the language of power. It is an honor to know that in this webinar, we are joined well by renowned Professor of History and International Relations, Professor Sfiso Ndlovu, and Dr. Tina Nzo as researcher in African Studies, who studied the formation of post-colonial bureaucracies. I read and cite from their recent collaborative book, publication chapter titled African National Congress Students in the Soviet Union, from 1960s to the 1980s, edited by Professor Vladimir Shobin and Professor Sfiso Ndlovu in 2024. Their research explores the ANC scholarship program for students who fled into exile. The ANC scholarship program was developed on the understanding that once liberation from apartheid domination has been achieved, the formation of a post-apartheid state would become central to the ANC's role as a post-apartheid governing party. This work draws from oral testimonial interviews with former ANC students or alumni who studied in the Soviet Union and archival material of the ANC kept at Fort Hare University. This is a very important yet significant piece of history that talks to today's webinar, that provides a much needed insight into the significant role of Russia or the former Soviet Union in educating African students through the socialist education system. It moves beyond the referencing of the high quality education system offered by the Soviet Union. Poverty does not diminish intelligence, it hides it. What is missing is not genius, but access to education. So, we must say clearly and without apology, education for the liberated must be an act of justice, not charity, not rhetoric, but justice. An egalitarian education does not ask whether the poor deserve to learn. It assumes that they must lead. It builds a world where the village school stands with the same dignity as the finest school in Sandton, where the child of a worker carries the same horizon as the child of the powerful. A nation that educates not only a few, chooses to see with one eye. Our history teaches us this. In the years of struggle, young Africans crossed oceans in search of knowledge, not as escape, but as a preparation. In distant classrooms, they learned science, strategy, discipline, and the language of power. It is an honor to know that in this webinar, we are joined well by renowned Professor of History and International Relations, Professor Sfiso Ndlovu, and Dr. Tina Nzo as researcher in African Studies, who studied the formation of post-colonial bureaucracies. I read and cite from their recent collaborative book, publication chapter titled African National Congress Students in the Soviet Union, from 1960s to the 1980s, edited by Professor Vladimir Shobin and Professor Sfiso Ndlovu in 2024. Their research explores the ANC scholarship program for students who fled into exile. The ANC scholarship program was developed on the understanding that once liberation from apartheid domination has been achieved, the formation of a post-apartheid state will become central to the ANC's role as a post-apartheid governing party. This work draws from oral testimonial interviews with former ANC students or alumni who studied in the Soviet Union and archival material of the ANC kept at Fort Hare University. This is very important yet significant piece of history that talks to today's webinar, that provides a much needed insight into the significant role of Russia or the former Soviet Union in educating African students through the socialist education system. It moves beyond the referencing of the high quality education system offered by the Soviet Union by capturing the everyday struggles experienced living in a foreign country, learning the Russian language, adapting to the cold Russian weather and socialist culture. More importantly, their work explores how the past-present realities of the students shape their understanding of what constitutes a struggle and sacrifice for obtaining education for liberation upon their return home post-1994, and their contribution made in transforming the post-apartheid state bureaucracy. They returned not only with degrees, but with purpose. They became leaders, thinkers, architects of new nations. This is our chronicle. Minds that left in struggle, returned with vision, and rose in responsibility. Today, the journey continues. Students travel across the world into laboratories, universities, and systems more advanced than ever before. But they do not go to become strangers to Africa. They go to gather the world and bring it home. This is not imitation. This is transformation. Between continents, quiet bridges are rising. A doctor trained abroad returns to a rural clinic and changes its destiny. An engineer designs infrastructure where there was none. A scientist applies global knowledge to local realities. These are the revolutions we do not always see, but they are the ones that will endure. And so, we must imagine an education that moves like light, touching every child, every village, every forgotten place without discrimination. An education that does not choose where it shines. An education that produces not only skilled individuals, but conscious human beings who understand that their future is bound to the future of others. I'm about to conclude now. In the end, the education of the liberated returns us to a simple, ancient truth. A person becomes a person through other people. This is Ubuntu. Not as a word, but as a way of being. The understanding that knowledge without humanity is incomplete, that progress without inclusion is fragile, and that no society can rise while leaving its people behind. It carries also a deeper call towards shared prosperity and justice, towards a world where education is not a privilege but a common good of humanity. If the last century was shaped by struggle and this one by transition, then the next century must be shaped by balance, by a world where knowledge, dignity, and opportunity are widely shared. So let us educate not for survival alone, but for creation. Let us not educate for a few, but for all. Let us educate not only minds, but humanity itself. For in doing so, we do more than prepare for the future. We build it. And in the act of building, Africa rises, not alone, but together into a better 22nd century. So I would like to conclude with a vision statement that as we look into the future, we must move beyond memory into purpose. The vision is very clear: to transform the historic bonds between Africa and the Russian Federation into a forward-looking partnership rooted in education, innovation, and shared development, where Ghana and South African students stand not only as beneficiaries of history, but as co-authors of a new global future defined by knowledge, dignity, and cooperation. Spasibo Bolshoi. Thank you very much.